So welcome back to another Whiteboard Wednesday, guys. In honor of Mental Health Awareness Week for 2021, I wanted to break down a few of the components in mental health when we specifically are talking about anxiety and depression, and kind of give you a little bit of a different look into those, what might be driving those, and then how we can kind of address this from a systemic view rather than just a single kind of phenomenon of just the brain and looking at anxiety from just a one-sided perspective. So anxiety as a whole tends to affect females more than males, and we see that across the US, but also internationally. And so it's one of the most common causes of hospitalizations for all people under the age of 45. Interestingly enough, depression along with anxiety, they tend to get lumped together, and it's the leading cause of disability worldwide. Suicide tends to follow those two, and it's the second leading cause of death among those 10 to 34 in the US. You can see to the left, this chart here ranks the top 10 states in the US that have reports of anxiety or individuals suffering from mental health conditions. Now, this breaks down to about 1 in 5 US adults that are experiencing some form of mental illness or mental distress. And then 1 in 20 US adults are going to experience some sort of serious mental illness. So that's a huge nationwide problem currently, but now we're seeing this even trickling down to our youth populations, where we're seeing those numbers getting as high as 17% for mental disorders within our youth populations. So the big question that always looms in my mind is why? What's driving a lot of this phenomenon that we're seeing? And I think we kind of have to address one of the big elephants in the room that no one really thinks is a problem, and that's social media. Now, when you look at research on social media and its correlation with anxiety and depression, especially in younger individuals, the data is not that encouraging. For example, this systematic review was looking at the prevalence of time spent on social media and the correlation in incidents of depression and anxiety, or just general psychological distress. Not surprisingly, there was a strong correlation between the two, and the more time that was spent on social media, the higher prevalence of those three psychological phenomena. Another study, just check out the highlighted part here. Adolescents who spent more time on new media, including social media or electronic devices, were more likely to report mental health issues than their peers who spent more time on non-screen activities, such as sports, homework, reading print media, or interacting with their peers. So I think this is a big part of this discussion that needs to kind of play a role in our thinking and how we're approaching this problem. If you look at data from this app called Moment, it basically looks at the amount of time spent on specific platforms from users of the app on their smartphones. And so you can see the different apps and the daily minutes spent on each app. And what you're likely going to see here is there's a large spectrum of the amount of time, the number of deviations basically between the total number of users. And at the lowest deviation, you're going to see that most of those users are pretty happy, and they also spend the least amount of time on the app. There's going to be some in the middle that represent all the users, kind of the standard bell curve right in the middle, but for the most part, those are kind of ambivalent. They don't have an opinion one way or another. And in almost all the categories, you can see that the users who are the most anxious or the most sad or the most depressed are also the ones who are spending the largest amount of time on those individual apps. Similarly, when we break this down in teens and you look at data on them, you'll see that their social media usage often led to them feeling like they were being left out or excluded by their peers. They also tended to delete social media posts that didn't have a large number of likes in a set amount of time that they perceived as being important. They also felt bad if other people didn't comment or interact on their post. So, I think we have to remember that this is not just a psychological issue, but it's also physiological, that when you have these individuals who are reacting negatively to something like social media, it can drive changes in the body. One of the big things, too, that's a huge part of this anxiety conversation is sleep. If you look at research on sleep, a single night of sleep deprivation, where you take someone and you sleep deprive them to 5 hours instead of the typical 8 hours, it increases perceived anxiety by 30%. Now it gets even more interesting because 65% of the current US population gets less than the recommended 7 hours of nightly sleep. Now, this becomes a problem because there's something in your brain known as the glymphatic system. And it's basically, you can think of it like this study describes it, it's a dishwashing cycle for the brain. It's where the brain basically clears out a lot of the metabolites and the waste that you generate throughout the day. When you sleep deprive someone, that clearance markedly goes down. And you've probably seen this before. This is the lymph system within the body, and this is how you clear out a lot of waste that the circulatory system or your blood supply can't get rid of. So you have your lymph nodes, and they're located all throughout your body. Now within the brain, it has a similar structure that helps with the drainage and removal of those metabolic byproducts. Now you can think of it a little bit more simply in that throughout the day you take in energy in the form of food, proteins, carbohydrates, and fat, and those contain vitamins and minerals, especially in fruits and vegetables, and that fuels the performance of the brain. Well, then at night you have to remove some of the waste or the byproducts that are generated from that metabolism over the course of the day. Now, if that doesn't occur, that can be correlated with all kinds of different phenomenons, from psychological to physiological. If we look at a quote from a man who studies sleep for a living, he's a neuroscientist at UC Cal Berkeley. Dr. Matthew Walker was famously quoted as saying, "The decimation of sleep throughout most industrialized nations and the marked escalation in anxiety disorders in those same countries is perhaps not coincidental, but causally related. The best bridge between despair and hope is a good night of sleep." So again, just lots of different factors in this whole conversation that I want you to be thinking about. And the last one that I want to kind of propose is this idea of the gut-brain axis. So there's this unique crosstalk between what's going on in your GI tract and what's going on in your brain. Similarly, what's going on in your brain can talk to your GI tract. So if we look at evidence of potential post-infection changes or even post-IBS changes and how that changes the brain, we can see that there are unique pathways between the brain and the GI tract. They're bidirectional, as this study noted. So what we can see is that perhaps anxiety doesn't start in the brain. Perhaps there are other functional disorders that are already taking place. The GI tract would be one place that these feelings of anxiety are propagated by. So again, another schematic just to give you a better idea of this whole concept. If we have a healthy function in both the GI tract and in the brain, they tend to talk between one another and all is well. But when that becomes altered with either microbes in the GI tract or you see changes to the brain, something such as a concussion, a car accident, a blow to the head, anything like that, that can influence the GI tract and vice versa. Don't get lost in the science. This is a very interesting article just in the fact that we can see changes in what's known as intestinal barrier permeability. It's commonly known as leaky gut. But when you see these changes, they're also correlated with anxiety and depression. So these changes can be driven by all kinds of different things, as you see in this picture here, that in a normal gut wall, this tends to keep out the bad stuff and allow in the good stuff, namely things like those macronutrients that I discussed, protein, fat, carbohydrates. After they're broken down in the constituent parts like amino acids and lipids, they're then absorbed out of the bloodstream and out of the intestines and into the bloodstream. However, in certain conditions like IBD or IBS, this gastrointestinal wall can become altered, and so these cells change their shape, which changes their function. And as we noted in the other study, this can sometimes be associated with anxiety and depression. Now things get really interesting when you start changing the GI tract with something as simple as probiotics. We can see that those alter inflammation in the intestinal wall, and you can see that the specific marker zonulin decreases when someone is administered specific strains of probiotics. Now typically zonulin is correlated with this change in the intestinal wall where you're starting to see this alteration in permeability or this leaky gut. So it's very interesting that you can provide probiotics and it decreases that prevalence of the excess leakiness. And you can even see that this decreases relative stress within humans and the perception of anxiety simply by changing the gut microbiome. If we look at a systematic meta-analysis, this is the highest level in terms of research hierarchy and what we look to for conclusions within research. They found that probiotic consumption may have a positive effect on psychological symptoms of depression, anxiety, and perceived stress. So as a whole, I just want you to get thinking about this problem in a variety of ways that not only can this be a brain issue singularly, but it can be a top-down issue where the brain is affecting the GI tract, and then vice versa, the GI tract goes on to affect the brain. And it can also work in reverse, where the GI tract has a problem, post-infectious, IBS, IBD, whatever propagates that initial issue, and that can lead to further dysfunction within the brain. But then we get so locked in on the brain that we forget to look at how the other systems are interacting and how there's this crosstalk. So I want to put these ideas out there so you guys can start to think about this whole phenomenon of anxiety, depression, mental health in a slightly different fashion, that we have to approach it from a systemic approach, not just from a singular pathway, a singular neurotransmitter, or a single biochemical mechanism, that there's a lot going on here that we really have to think about and consider.